Hey guys, tonight we follow a man who rose from the rough streets of Brooklyn to become the face of organized crime in America. He didn't just survive prohibition, he owned it, turning bootlegging into an empire that made him one of the most powerful and feared men of his time. We're talking about Alphonse Al Capone, the man the world came to know as Scarface. Picture this, it's the roaring 1920s. Chicago is a city of jazz, speakeasies, and shadows, where money talks louder than law and gangsters rule the streets. While most mobsters stayed hidden in the background, Capone stepped into the spotlight. A crime boss who dressed sharp, smiled for the cameras, and lived larger than life, all while building a fortune off forbidden liquor. You might think this is just a story about shootouts and speakeasies, but it's really about ambition, power, and the price of both. It's about how one man became a legend of the underworld, and what happens when the empire you build makes you a target for everyone, from rivals to the federal government. So before we dive in, hit that like button if you enjoy these late-night mob tales, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and follow me into the Chicago underworld, where Al Capone learned that power can make you untouchable, until the day it doesn't. Imagine a city humming with secret music, where laughter from behind closed doors mixes with the clink of glasses filled with liquor that wasn't supposed to exist. Imagine men in tailored suits, stepping from sleek cars, their names whispered in fear and awe, while policemen looked the other way and politicians shook hands in back rooms. And at the center of it all was a young man with a scar on his face, a grin that could disarm or intimidate, and a hunger for power that knew no boundaries. His name was Al Capone, and in the roaring 20s, he would rise from the crowded streets of Brooklyn to become the most infamous figure in Chicago's history. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents who had come to New York with little more than hope. The Capone family lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, packed with siblings, noise, and the smell of home-cooked meals. His father was a barber, his mother a seamstress. They worked long hours hoping to give their children a better life, but the neighborhood around them was rough, filled with gangs that ruled the alleys and playgrounds. Young Al quickly realized that respect was earned not in classrooms but on the streets. School was not for him. Bright but restless, he often clashed with teachers and authority. One day, after striking a teacher who tried to discipline him, he was expelled at 14. With little education and few prospects, he drifted toward the gangs that shaped his neighborhood. Street corners were controlled by tough boys who fought with fists, bats, and knives, and Al wanted to belong. He joined small groups first, running errands, watching older boys handle business. But it wasn't long before he sought something bigger. Al found himself under the influence of Johnny Torrio, a man who carried himself with quiet confidence and who would later become one of the greatest influences in his life. Torrio believed crime could be organized, efficient, almost like a business. He valued loyalty and intelligence over reckless violence, and Al learned from him. While still a teenager, Capone also worked at the Harvard Inn, a Coney Island bar owned by gangster Frankie Yale. It was here that he earned the scar that would stay with him forever. One night, after insulting a woman, her brother slashed Al across the face with a knife. The deep wound left 3 jagged scars on his left cheek, and from then on he was called Scarface. Al hated the nickname, preferring to tilt his face to hide the scars in photographs. But it gave him a certain notoriety on the street. People remembered him. They remembered the scar, the glare, the way he carried himself with a mix of charm and menace. By his late teens, Al had gained a reputation as both a fighter and a smooth talker. He could intimidate with his fists, but also win people over with humor and charisma. He wasn't the kind of gangster who relied only on violence. He had a way of making friends, of finding allies, of convincing people he was someone worth following. Those skills would carry him far beyond Brooklyn. In 1919, when prohibition loomed on the horizon, Torrio moved to Chicago to work under crime boss Big Jim Colosimo. Al followed, leaving behind the crowded streets of New York for the booming city on Lake Michigan. Chicago in 1919 was a place of opportunity and chaos. Prohibition had just been enacted, banning the sale of alcohol, but demand had not vanished. In fact, it had skyrocketed. Every bar became a speakeasy, every shipment of liquor became a potential fortune, and every ambitious man saw opportunity in the law's failure. For Al Capone, Chicago was a fresh canvas. Under Torrio's guidance, he became enforcer, collector, and trusted lieutenant. His scarred face and burly frame made him intimidating, but his sharp mind made him invaluable. He knew how to run operations smoothly, how to keep money flowing, how to handle both allies and enemies. Chicago was a city divided between gangs, but Torrio's organization was one of the strongest, and Al was learning the ropes of an empire. At just 20 years old, Capone was already more than a street thug. He was becoming a man of influence, a figure known in gambling halls, nightclubs, and speakeasies. He dressed well, spoke confidently, and carried himself like someone destined for more. Behind the scenes, he managed shipments of Canadian whiskey, controlled gambling dens, and ensured Torrio's rackets ran with precision. But in Chicago, no man's rise was without blood. Rival gangs fought over territory, policemen demanded bribes, and politicians sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. Al quickly saw that survival meant striking first, showing strength, and never appearing weak. He carried Torrio's lessons with him, balancing violence with strategy, fear with charm. And as the city's appetite for illegal liquor grew, so too did the power of the men who supplied it. In the early 1920s, Al Capone was still in the shadow of Johnny Torrio, but his presence was undeniable. He was young, ambitious, and fearless. The scar on his face was not just a mark of violence. It was a symbol of survival, a reminder that he had endured and was still standing. And in a city about to explode with opportunity and danger, that survival would make him unstoppable. Chicago didn't yet know it, but the name Al Capone was about to become legend. Chicago in the early 1920s was a city split between law and appetite. The law said no alcohol, but the people demanded it more than ever. Behind closed doors, music blared, glasses clinked, and laughter spilled out of secret rooms where bartenders poured whiskey smuggled in from Canada or gin brewed in back alley stills. For every speakeasy that was shut down by police, 3 more opened the next night. Prohibition didn't kill liquor. It gave it a new life. And Al Capone was there to seize it. Working under Johnny Torrio, Al quickly proved himself indispensable. Torrio was the architect, the strategist who believed crime could be run like a business. He valued brains over brute force, and he saw in Al a rare mix of both. Al wasn't just muscle. He had charm, wit, and a knack for organizing men. He could smile in one moment and strike in the next, always with a sense of calculation. Torrio trusted him with more responsibility, and soon Al was managing operations that reached across the city. Liquor was the outfit's lifeblood. Shipments came in by the truckload, hidden under crates of fruit or vegetables smuggled across borders, ferried in by boats across the Great Lakes. Al oversaw deliveries, made sure drivers were loyal, and kept the police off their backs with steady bribes. Corruption was as important as guns in Chicago, and Al learned that paying the right man at the right time could make trouble vanish. Policemen who raided speakeasies one night might be drinking there the next if the envelopes were thick enough. Al's job wasn't just logistics. He handled disputes too, and Chicago was full of them. Rival gangs fought constantly over territory. Neighborhoods were carved into invisible lines, and crossing them could mean death. Al had a way of handling these conflicts. Sometimes he negotiated, sitting down with rivals and finding compromises. Other times he sent a message in blood. Either way, the result was the same. The outfit's power grew, and Al's reputation grew with it. By 1922, Al was no longer just Torrio's right-hand man. He was becoming the face of the operation. Dressed in sharp suits, wide-brimmed hats tilted low, and a cigar between his fingers, he carried himself like a man untouchable. Speakeasy owners respected him. Gamblers feared him. Politicians nodded to him in public and whispered to him in private. Al had stepped out of the shadows and into a role that made him both admired and feared. The city itself was a battlefield disguised as a party. On the surface, jazz bands played, couples danced, and cocktails flowed. Beneath it, bodies piled up in alleys. Trucks were hijacked on dark roads, and men carried pistols under their coats as naturally as they carried wallets. Every gang wanted control, and the stakes were always rising. The O'Banion crew, led by Dion O'Banion, was one of Torrio and Capone's fiercest rivals. They controlled parts of the north side, and they weren't shy about defending their turf. Al thrived in this world of tension. He was fearless, never hesitating to ride along on jobs, to stand in a speakeasy during a raid, to confront rivals face to face. Men followed him not just because Torrio ordered it, but because Al commanded loyalty. He was generous to his men, sharing profits, throwing parties, and making them feel part of something bigger. Yet they also knew he expected absolute loyalty in return. Betrayal was not tolerated, and those who forgot that learned quickly. His family life was quieter, though not free of conflict. Al married May Josephine Coughlin, an Irish-American woman, in 1918, and together they had a son, Albert Francis, known as Sonny. Al loved his family deeply, and despite the violence of his work, he tried to shield them from it. At home, he was playful with his boy, attentive to May, almost like any other husband and father. But the duality defined him. At home, tender. In the streets, ruthless. As prohibition tightened its grip on America, Chicago became a playground for men like Al. Wealth poured in. Speakeasies operated openly under the noses of police. Judges were bought, juries swayed, politicians persuaded. Money talked louder than the law, and the outfit's voice was the loudest of all. Al wasn't content with small profits. He wanted scale. He wanted Chicago to belong to them. But success brought danger. The more the outfit expanded, the more enemies it created. Shootouts erupted in broad daylight. Cars sprayed with bullets sped down busy streets, leaving civilians ducking for cover. Newspapers began to take notice, and soon Al's name started appearing in print. At first, he was mentioned only as Torrio's lieutenant, a background figure. But reporters sensed something about him, the way he carried himself, the way men followed him. The spotlight was beginning to find him, whether he wanted it or not. Torrio tried to keep Al focused, reminding him that attention was dangerous, that quiet power lasted longer than loud fame. Al listened, but inside, he liked the recognition. He liked that his name carried weight, that people knew who he was. He wasn't reckless yet, but the seeds of ambition were already sprouting. He wanted more than just to serve Torrio. He wanted to be Torrio. By 1923, Al Capone was already a name to fear in Chicago. The outfit's empire was growing, fueled by liquor, gambling, and corruption. Torrio was still in charge, but Al was the one people saw, the one they whispered about. And in a city where every step forward brought another fight, Al was ready for whatever came next. By 1924, Chicago was no longer just a city of opportunity. It was a battlefield. Every corner tavern, every speakeasy, every gambling hall was a prize worth killing for. Bootlegging had turned ordinary thugs into businessmen, and businessmen into generals commanding armies of gunmen. The city was awash in liquor, and each barrel brought profit, power, and bloodshed. Al Capone thrived in this world, but the rising violence tested even his mentor Johnny Torrio. The outfit had grown strong, but rivals were relentless. Chief among them was Dion O'Banion, leader of the North Side gang. O'Banion was flashy, a florist by day and gangster by night, and he hated the outfit's growing dominance. Tensions between Torrio's outfit and O'Banion's men escalated constantly. Hijackings, double crosses, and shootouts kept the streets buzzing. Al, who had risen to be Torrio's most trusted lieutenant, handled much of the dirty work, smoothing over problems when possible, striking hard when necessary. The breaking point came in 1924 when O'Banion tricked Torrio into buying a brewery that was about to be raided by police. Torrio lost money and respect, and he vowed revenge. Later that year, O'Banion was lured to his flower shop, supposedly for a handshake deal. Instead, he was gunned down, riddled with bullets in a killing that shocked Chicago. The newspapers splashed the murder across their pages, and the public began to see just how violent the underworld had become. The North Side Gang, however, didn't crumble. They retaliated, and Torrio soon became their prime target. In January 1925, as Torrio returned home from shopping with his wife, gunmen ambushed him outside his apartment. Bullets tore into his body, and he was left critically wounded. Somehow he survived, but the experience shook him deeply. Torrio had always been pragmatic. He saw crime as business, not a war. Lying in a hospital bed, scarred and weakened, he realized the cost of power had become too high. When he recovered, he shocked everyone by stepping aside. He handed the reins of the outfit to his young protege, Al Capone. Al was only 26 years old when he became the boss of Chicago's most powerful criminal organization. Where Torrio had preferred subtlety and calculation, Al embraced boldness and dominance. He didn't shy from attention. In fact, he relished it. Newspapers that once treated him as Torrio's lieutenant now called him king of the Chicago underworld. And Al leaned into the role, building an empire that would make him both infamous and untouchable. As leader, Al expanded the outfit's reach. He controlled breweries, distilleries, and distribution networks that spanned the city. He opened more speakeasies, tightened his grip on gambling, and branched into new rackets. Every business paid him one way or another, through protection money, partnership, or outright ownership. His power extended not just through criminals, but through politicians and police officers, all on his payroll. He understood that bribery was cheaper than bullets, but when money failed, he wasn't afraid to unleash violence. Capone also understood the value of image. He dressed in custom suits, wore flashy jewelry, and drove expensive cars. He dined in the best restaurants, tipped lavishly, and mingled with celebrities. To many, he was larger than life, the embodiment of the Jazz Age's wild spirit. Ordinary Chicagoans, struggling during economic downturns, often saw him as a kind of Robin Hood. He opened soup kitchens, gave to charity, and made sure poor families had coal in the winter. To them, Capone wasn't just a gangster, he was a benefactor. But beneath the generosity was ruthless control. The North Side Gang, now led by Jaime Weiss and later Bugs Moran, continued to challenge him. Shootouts erupted across Chicago, sometimes in broad daylight, leaving bodies on sidewalks and bullets lodged in storefronts. Capone responded with escalating force, arming his men with Tommy guns, fast cars, and the discipline of soldiers. The outfit became less like a street gang and more like an army, with Capone as its general. The violence drew national attention. Newspapers from New York to Los Angeles reported on the gang wars in Chicago, painting the city as a place of both excitement and terror. Capone's name became synonymous with bootlegging, gangsters, and prohibition. He was the face of organized crime, and while law enforcement struggled to contain him, the public couldn't look away. He was feared, admired, and envied all at once. Despite the bloodshed, Capone's empire grew. By the mid-1920s, his operations were estimated to bring in tens of millions of dollars annually. Liquor flowed through hidden tunnels, gambling dens thrived in back rooms, and politicians who opposed him found themselves out of office. Or worse, he was untouchable, or so it seemed. Al also began to realize the power of publicity. He allowed reporters to interview him, sometimes portraying himself as a businessman unfairly maligned. He claimed he was just providing what the public wanted: liquor, entertainment, a good time. And in many ways, he wasn't wrong. Chicago's speakeasies were packed every night, and demand never slowed. Prohibition had created the market, and Al Capone supplied it. But power always brought enemies. Law enforcement, though often bribed, couldn't ignore the mounting chaos. Politicians in Washington began to see Capone not just as a local problem, but as a national symbol of lawlessness. And rival gangs, no matter how many were crushed, always seemed to rise again. The city was rich with opportunity, and everyone wanted a piece. By 1926, Al Capone was firmly in control of the outfit. but his empire rested on fragile ground. Torrio had stepped aside because he saw the danger. Al, younger and hungrier, embraced it. He lived for the power, the fame, the wealth. But each step higher on the ladder made the fall that much greater. For now, though, he was king of Chicago. The scarred kid from Brooklyn had become the most powerful gangster in America, and his reign was only just beginning. By 1926, Chicago had fully embraced its reputation as the city that never truly went dry. While prohibition agents raided small speakeasies in other towns, Chicago's nightlife flourished openly under the shadow of Al Capone. Jazz poured from hidden rooms, flappers danced with cocktails in hand, and men with thick wallets lined up for liquor that flowed as if the law didn't exist. In truth, the law barely did. Judges were bribed, police were bought, and politicians bent their loyalties according to the weight of an envelope. Behind it all, Capone's empire reached into every corner of the city, making him both a feared gangster and a strange kind of folk hero. His profits soared. Newspapers estimated his operations brought in more than $100 million annually, an astronomical figure for the time. Bootlegging remained the backbone, but gambling dens, brothels, and protection rackets padded the fortune. The outfit had become an empire with accountants, managers, and enforcers, all moving under Capone's watchful eye. He was no longer just a crime boss. He was running a shadow corporation that rivaled legitimate businesses in both revenue and efficiency. Al's public image fascinated the press. Reporters flocked to him, eager for quotes, and he obliged with a mix of bravado and charm. He liked to portray himself not as a criminal, but as a businessman providing what the people wanted. "I give the public what the public wants," he once said, and in many ways it was true. Chicagoans didn't just tolerate his presence, they celebrated it. He donated to charities, supported soup kitchens, and made sure poor families had coal during freezing winters. To many struggling through economic hardship, Capone seemed like a man of the people. But to his rivals, he was a predator. The North Side Gang, led after Jaime Weiss's death by George "Bugs" Moran, stood as the most defiant challenge to Capone's rule. Moran despised him, calling him a coward and mocking his scarred face. Their battles were relentless, with trucks hijacked, breweries torched, and gunmen sprayed down in drive-by shootings. The streets became a war zone, and ordinary citizens sometimes found themselves caught in the crossfire. Capone responded with escalation. He armed his men with Thompson submachine guns, the Tommy gun, that turned firefights into massacres. His soldiers rode in black sedans, ready to unleash torrents of bullets on rivals. Each attack left another headline, another grim photograph of bodies sprawled across sidewalks. Yet, despite the violence, Capone's grip only tightened. Politicians still bent to him, police still turned away, and the public still filled his speakeasies. By 1927, Capone was the undisputed ruler of Chicago's underworld, but the rivalry with Moran refused to die. Moran controlled parts of the North Side, particularly lucrative, territories for bootlegging, and he refused to surrender. Their war reached a fever pitch as Moran taunted Capone in the press, and Capone plotted to end the threat once and for all. The plan unfolded on February 14, 1929. That morning, 7 men associated with Moran's gang were lined up against a wall in a Chicago garage. They had been lured there under the pretense of a liquor deal. Suddenly, men dressed as police officers entered, barking orders. The Moran men complied, believing it was a routine raid. Moments later, gunfire erupted. Tommy guns rattled, echoing through the garage, and when it was over, the floor was slick with blood. 6 of Moran's men and an unlucky associate lay dead, their bodies riddled with bullets. The massacre shocked the nation. Newspapers splashed the story across front pages with gruesome photographs of the slain men. The public, long entertained by stories of gangsters and speakeasies, now recoiled at the brutality. Though Capone was in Florida at the time and no evidence directly tied him to the shooting, the world was convinced he had ordered it. The St. Valentine's Day massacre became the defining moment of his reign. a display of power so ruthless that it ended Moran's challenge but forever stained Capone's image. In Chicago, the message was clear. No one could defy Al Capone and live. Bugs Moran himself escaped the massacre by chance, arriving late to the meeting, but his gang was shattered. The North Side's power dwindled, and Capone's dominance solidified. Yet while the massacre secured his control, it also marked the beginning of his downfall. Law enforcement, embarrassed by the brazenness of the slaughter, could no longer ignore him. Politicians in Washington, pressured by outraged citizens, demanded action. Capone had crossed a line. Still, in the immediate aftermath, Al continued to live like a king. He dined in Chicago's best restaurants, smoked the finest cigars, and drove luxurious cars. He hosted lavish parties, mingled with celebrities, and posed for photographs with a grin that suggested nothing could touch him. He seemed untouchable, larger than life, a man who had built an empire on illegal liquor and dared anyone to take it away. But beneath the glamour, cracks were forming. The massacre had united law enforcement against him in a way nothing else had. The press, once eager for his quotes, began to portray him as a monster. Even ordinary Chicagoans, who had once cheered his generosity, now whispered about the blood spilled on their streets. The government was watching, and Al Capone, for all his money and influence, had made himself the most wanted man in America. For now, though, he was still at the peak of his power. The outfit ran Chicago. His fortune was unmatched, and his name was known in every corner of the country. He had risen from a scarred kid in Brooklyn to the king of Chicago. But as the 1930s approached, the empire he had built on liquor, charm, and violence was beginning to attract a storm he could not bribe or shoot his way out of. After the garage floor on Clark Street was scrubbed clean of blood and the 7 bodies carted away, Chicago could no longer pretend the violence was simply the cost of nightlife. The St. Valentine's Day massacre of 1929 had sent shockwaves across the nation. For years, people had treated stories of gangsters almost like pulp fiction. Dangerous, yes, but distant, even glamorous. But now photographs of riddled corpses stared back from newspaper front pages, and the public recoiled. It wasn't just Chicago that cared anymore. Washington was watching, and so was the world. Al Capone, sitting in Florida during the killings, denied involvement. No witness could place him there. No evidence tied him directly. But everyone assumed he had ordered it. He laughed it off to reporters, insisting he was just a businessman unfairly blamed for violence he couldn't control. Yet no one believed him. Scarface was now synonymous with ruthless, power, and while the massacre had crippled Bugs Moran's gang, it had also drawn attention Capone could not shake. Law enforcement agencies, embarrassed by years of failure to bring him down, redoubled their efforts. Chicago's police stepped up raids on his breweries and speakeasies. Federal prohibition agents, pressured by the government, targeted his bootlegging operations. But Al had long ago mastered the art of bribery. He paid off officers, tipped politicians, and treated judges like employees. For every raid that seized liquor, dozens more shipments slipped through. His empire continued to flow with cash. Yet the pressure was undeniable. His every move was trailed by reporters. He couldn't dine in a restaurant without photographers snapping his picture. He couldn't step into court without headlines the next morning. The visibility he once enjoyed became a burden. Torrio had always warned him that the spotlight would bring trouble. Now, Capone was learning just how right his old mentor had been. Still, he tried to maintain his image as a man of the people. During the Great Depression's early years, he opened soup kitchens, feeding thousands of hungry Chicagoans. He ensured that poor families received coal during brutal winters. Newspapers, even while condemning him for bloodshed, printed photographs of long bread lines outside kitchens marked, "Free Soup by Al Capone." To struggling citizens, he was both villain and savior. Parents cursed his name in the morning and sent their children to his kitchens in the evening. But generosity couldn't shield him from the law forever. Prosecutors, unable to pin him to murders or bootlegging, turned to a different tactic: money. They realized that Capone, despite his fortune, had never filed proper tax returns. His arrogance, The belief that he was untouchable had left him exposed. Federal investigators began building a case for tax evasion, tracking the money he spent on hotels, cars, jewelry, and parties. Every receipt, every ledger, every banknote became evidence. Capone, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing could touch him. He lived lavishly in a Palm Island mansion in Miami, entertained stars, and continued to run his empire from afar. He traveled with an entourage, tipped extravagantly, and spoke freely to reporters, always insisting he was just a misunderstood businessman. But the walls were closing in. Violence in Chicago hadn't ceased. Moran's gang, though weakened, still lashed out when they could. Smaller outfits tried to carve their own territories, leading to more bloodshed. Capone responded with his usual mix of charm and terror, holding peace conferences with rivals one day and unleashing gunmen the next. But each new killing made the headlines bigger, the scrutiny harsher. In 1930, the Chicago Crime Commission officially named Capone Public Enemy Number 1. The title stuck, plastered across newspapers, reinforcing his status as America's most infamous outlaw. It was a badge of infamy that he could never escape. To the public, he was no longer just a gangster running speakeasies. He was the face of crime in America. Despite the heat, Capone remained confident. He believed his money and influence could protect him from any prosecution. For years it had. Judges dismissed charges, juries were bribed, witnesses disappeared. Whenever it seemed he might be cornered, he wriggled free. But behind the scenes, federal agents were patient, slowly piecing together a case he couldn't bribe his way out of. In 1931, their work paid off. Capone was indicted not for murder, not for bootlegging, but for tax evasion. The irony was sharp. The man who had built an empire of blood and liquor, who had survived gang wars and massacres, was finally brought down by something as mundane as unpaid taxes. Al laughed when he first heard, dismissing it as a nuisance. But soon he realized the government was serious. This wasn't just another case to be bribed away. This was a full assault, with the federal government determined to make an example of him. For Al Capone, the late 1920s had been his peak, a time of wealth, power, and fame unmatched by any gangster before or since. But by the early 1930s, the storm he had always thought he could outrun was directly overhead. The boy from Brooklyn who had become the King of Chicago was about to discover that no empire, no matter how rich or feared, could last forever. In 1931, the unthinkable began to unfold for Al Capone. After years of slipping through the fingers of law enforcement, bribing police, intimidating witnesses, and dodging murder charges, he now faced something he had never truly considered a threat: tax evasion. To a man who had ordered massacres and lived above the law, the idea that a ledger, a receipt, or a missing form could undo him must have seemed laughable. At first, he brushed it off. He had always believed his money could buy freedom, and for years it had. But this time, the government was different. They weren't coming at him with prohibition agents or local police who could be bought with an envelope. They were sending federal prosecutors, men determined to bring down America's most infamous gangster. President Herbert Hoover himself had reportedly demanded that Capone be taken down, embarrassed by the headlines Chicago's violence was generating. When the federal government decided to make an example, no bribe was big enough to stop it. The case was simple on the surface. Capone had lived a life of enormous luxury: mansions in Miami, diamond-studded jewelry, silk suits, and fleets of cars. But he had never filed proper tax returns. Investigators tracked his spending, built a paper trail, and argued that he owed hundreds of thousands in back taxes. For a man who had once laughed that taxes were a problem for ordinary businessmen, not for him, it was a brutal irony. As the trial approached, Capone remained confident. He was used to winning. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, men who had previously gotten charges dismissed, cases dropped, and juries swayed. Behind the scenes, Al even tried to rig the jury, bribing potential jurors to ensure a favorable verdict. But Judge James Wilkerson, presiding over the case, anticipated the move. At the last moment, he switched the entire jury pool with another panel. Capone's money couldn't save him this time. The courtroom drama captivated the nation. Reporters filled the benches. Sketch artists drew every smirk and gesture, and the public devoured each day's testimony in the papers. Al, dressed sharply as always, tried to project confidence, even charm. He smiled, joked with guards, and shook hands with fans who gathered outside. But beneath the swagger, he must have felt the shift. For the first time in his career, he wasn't in control. The evidence stacked up. Witnesses testified about the ledgers that recorded his gambling profits, about the payments made in his name. Bookkeepers, clerks, and agents all chipped away at the myth of the untouchable Capone. His lawyers argued furiously, trying to downplay the charges, but the prosecution had momentum. What had once seemed impossible, convicting Al Capone, now seemed inevitable. On October 17, 1931, the verdict came, guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. Judge Wilkerson sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, the harshest penalty ever handed down for tax crimes at the time. He was fined $50,000, ordered to pay back taxes, and denied bail. The mighty Al Capone, King of Chicago, public enemy number 1, was led away in handcuffs. The fall was seismic. Newspapers that once glamorized him now printed triumphant headlines. Citizens who had once lined up for his soup kitchens now saw him as just another criminal caught at last. To law enforcement, it was a vindication, proof that no man, no matter how rich or feared, was above the law. For the outfit, it was both a relief and a problem. Capone's reign had brought wealth, but it had also brought unbearable attention. With him gone, the organization could return to quieter leadership, but the shadow of his fame would never fully fade. Capone was first sent to Atlanta Penitentiary. At 32 years old, he entered prison not as a boss, but as an inmate, stripped of his power and surrounded by guards who answered to no one but the government. He tried at first to carry himself with the same swagger, tipping guards, demanding special treatment. But the Bureau of Prisons was determined to make an example. Al was denied privileges, placed under strict watch, and forced to endure the same routines as every other prisoner. Even behind bars, though, his name carried weight. Other inmates whispered about him. Guards eyed him with both suspicion and fascination, and visitors flocked to catch a glimpse of the man who had once ruled Chicago. But Al was restless. He complained about the conditions, about the food, about the lack of respect. For a man who had once commanded armies of men and millions of dollars, prison was suffocating. His lawyers worked tirelessly to appeal, but each effort failed. The sentence held firm. Capone was trapped, and for the first time, money and violence couldn't change his fate. The man who had built an empire on liquor and intimidation was now reduced to a number in the federal system. Still, Al's story wasn't finished. In 1934, after serving a few years in Atlanta, officials decided he was too influential there. He had begun to bribe guards again, bending small rules, gaining small favors. The Bureau of Prisons wanted to crush the myth of Capone once and for all. And so, they transferred him to a place built to break the spirit of the most dangerous men in America, a cold, isolated rock in San Francisco Bay known as Alcatraz. The boy from Brooklyn, who had risen to be the most feared gangster in America, was now on his way to the island prison designed to erase legends. By 1939, Al Capone was no longer the swaggering king of Chicago. Years in Alcatraz had stripped away his power, and illness had taken its toll. His mind was fading, his body weakened, and the empire he once controlled moved on without him. Doctors finally diagnosed what many had suspected. Untreated syphilis, contracted years earlier, had spread through his system, eating away at his nervous system and leaving him confused, erratic, sometimes childlike. The man who had once orchestrated million-dollar bootlegging operations now struggled to remember conversations. His release from prison wasn't a triumph but an act of mercy. After serving nearly 8 years of his 11-year sentence, authorities decided he was no longer a threat. He was too sick to run rackets, too frail to command soldiers. When he walked out in November 1939, The world barely recognized him. He had lost weight, his once sharp gaze was dulled, and his mind often wandered in strange directions. The press followed him, snapping photographs, but the legend looked more like a ghost of himself than the fearsome gangster they remembered. Al returned to his family, retreating first to Baltimore for treatment and eventually to his mansion on Palm Island, a lush estate in Miami. There, surrounded by palm trees and the glitter of Florida sunshine, he lived out his final years not as a boss, but as a patient. May, his loyal wife, cared for him, protecting him from the public eye as much as possible. Their son, Sonny, visited often, trying to hold on to the father he had once known. But the man who had been public enemy number one was slipping away, piece by piece. In Florida, Capone lived quietly, often sitting in his garden or fishing in the waters near his home. Neighbors occasionally spotted him, but the aura of menace was gone. Instead of cigar smoke and sharp suits, they saw an aging man in casual clothes, sometimes confused, sometimes serene, often lost in thought. He would tell stories of his past, but they were fragmented, half-remembered tales that blurred reality and fantasy. The FBI kept tabs on him, but by then there was no empire left to watch. The Chicago outfit had moved on under new leadership, men who learned from Capone's downfall to stay in the shadows. They avoided the spotlight he had embraced, preferring quiet profits over newspaper headlines. Capone's reign had been spectacular, but it had also been a lesson. Invisibility, not fame, was the path to survival. Visitors occasionally came to Palm Island, curious to see the once great gangster. Some left saddened, realizing the legend was gone. Others left unnerved, still catching glimpses of the old Capone in his rare moments of clarity, when his eyes sharpened and his voice carried the authority of the past. But those moments grew fewer as the years passed. May shielded him fiercely. She refused to let the press exploit his decline, keeping interviews rare. When Al Capone arrived at Alcatraz in August of 1934, the man who once ruled Chicago like a king found himself reduced to a number, AZ-85. The Rock, as the prison was called, was unlike any place he had ever known. Built on a cold, windswept island in San Francisco Bay, it was designed to be escape-proof, a fortress of concrete and steel, where America's most dangerous prisoners were sent to be broken. For Capone, who had once dined in Chicago's finest restaurants and commanded armies of gunmen, Alcatraz was a brutal new reality. From the moment he stepped off the boat, the rules were different. There were no bribes here, no guards willing to be bought, no politicians to lean on. The warden, James A. Johnston, was determined that Capone would receive no special treatment. He would wear the same uniform as every other inmate, eat the same food, march to the same schedules, and work the same jobs. The man who had once declared himself untouchable was stripped of his privileges and forced to live by the rigid discipline of the prison. Capone tried at first to assert himself. In Atlanta, he had managed to bribe guards for small favors, securing comforts other inmates envied. He believed he could do the same here. But Alcatraz wasn't like Atlanta. The guards were hand-picked, the system was airtight, and any attempt to bend the rules was met with swift punishment. When Capone tried to use his charm, the warden shut him down. "You're just like everyone else here," Johnston told him. For a man who had spent years cultivating an image of power, it was a crushing blow. Life on Alcatraz was monotonous and punishing. Capone was assigned menial jobs: laundry, sewing, mopping floors. He worked in the prison's textile shop, operating sewing machines for hours at a time. The man who once handled million-dollar liquor shipments now stitched uniforms under the watchful eyes of guards. He was ridiculed by some fellow inmates, who saw in his fall a kind of justice, but others still treated him with respect, partly out of fear, partly out of awe at his reputation. To many prisoners, Capone was still the most famous gangster in America, even if Alcatraz had reduced him to routine. The isolation gnawed at him. Capone had always thrived in crowds, nightclubs, speakeasies, restaurants buzzing with laughter and music. Now, His world was a 6 by 9 cell with a narrow cot, a sink, and a toilet. The silence of Alcatraz was broken only by the clanging of bars and the shouts of guards. He began to unravel, both physically and mentally. The syphilis he had contracted years earlier, untreated and ignored, was advancing, attacking his nervous system. Headaches, mood swings, and confusion plagued him. Sometimes he lashed out at other inmates, other times he withdrew completely. In 1936, during a scuffle in the prison yard, another inmate stabbed him with a pair of scissors. Capone survived the attack, but the incident showed just how vulnerable he had become. Once feared and untouchable, he was now just another prisoner, subject to the same dangers as the men he had once commanded. His health worsened steadily. Prison doctors noted signs of neurosyphilis, dementia, paranoia, memory loss. At times, Capone seemed like a man twice his age, shuffling through corridors, muttering to himself, unable to focus. Other times, he snapped back into moments of clarity, sharp and commanding, a flash of the old boss. But those moments grew fewer. The disease was robbing him of the very traits that had defined him: his wit, his confidence, his control. By the late 1930s, Capone's decline was obvious. The Bureau of Prisons monitored his condition closely, and by 1939, it was clear he could no longer function as an ordinary inmate. His mind had regressed so severely that doctors estimated he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. The man who had once orchestrated the St. Valentine's Day massacre could no longer follow simple conversations. He was transferred from Alcatraz to Terminal Island in California, and shortly after, granted early release on compassionate grounds. When he walked out of prison in November 1939, he was only 40 years old, but he looked and behaved decades older. The newspapers reported his release with fascination, but those who saw him were struck by how far he had fallen. The swagger was gone, the sharp suits replaced by simple clothes, the quick mind dulled by illness. He returned not to Chicago, but to his family, retreating to places where May, his wife, could shield him from the world. For Al Capone, Alcatraz had been the end of the myth. It stripped him of his power, his pride, and eventually his mind. The empire he had built carried on under new leaders, but without him, it operated in quieter, more discreet ways. His name still carried weight, but he was no longer part of the game. He was a relic, a ghost of a man who had once ruled Chicago, now fading into obscurity. When Al Capone walked free in November of 1939, the newspapers declared the King of Chicago had returned. But those who saw him knew the truth. The man who stepped out of prison was not the same Al Capone who had once dined in silk suits and commanded legions of gangsters. He was frail, weakened, and mentally diminished. Years of untreated syphilis, worsened by the hardships of prison, had ravaged his body and mind. Though he was only 40 years old, he seemed decades older. His wife May greeted him with quiet devotion. She had stood by him through the headlines, the trial, the prison years, and now she shielded him from the public eye. Together with their son, Sonny, she moved Al to Baltimore, where doctors attempted to treat him at Union Memorial Hospital. There, he received penicillin, a relatively new treatment at the time, but the disease had already advanced too far. The damage to his nervous system was irreversible. After months of treatment, Capone and his family relocated to Florida, settling in the lavish Palm Island mansion he had purchased years earlier during his reign. The estate was surrounded by palm trees, with sweeping views of Biscayne Bay, a paradise compared to the steel and concrete of Alcatraz. But for Capone, it was less a palace than a sanctuary for decline. Neighbors were curious, sometimes unnerved, knowing that the world's most infamous gangster lived among them. Guards patrolled the estate at first, but the need for protection faded as the truth became clear. Capone was no longer the feared Scarface. He was a sick man who spent his days fishing quietly off the dock, sitting in the garden or wandering the halls in confusion. His once fiery temper gave way to childlike moods. Sometimes he played with his grandnieces and nephews like a kindly uncle, his memory of his former self slipping further away. May remained his protector. She refused interviews, avoided publicity, and did everything possible to preserve his dignity. She wanted the world to forget the headlines, the massacres, the blood. To her, he was simply Al, her husband, the man she had married as a teenager. She shielded him from the glare of reporters who still tried to pry into his life, keeping them at bay with polite refusals or firm silence. The FBI still kept an eye on him, though more out of formality than necessity. Agents occasionally visited Miami, checking to see if Capone was plotting a comeback. But there was no empire left for him to reclaim. The Chicago outfit had moved on under new leadership, run by men who had learned from Capone's mistakes to stay quiet, avoid the spotlight, and keep profits flowing without drawing national outrage. Capone's time had passed, and his name was now a cautionary tale. Visitors sometimes came to Palm Island, curious to see the fallen king. A few old associates stopped by, but most had long since moved on, leaving Capone to his family. Some guests left shaken, realizing the man they remembered was gone. The sharp eyes that once intimidated rivals were now clouded. The booming voice that once commanded rooms was soft, sometimes incoherent. He was a man fading before their eyes. Despite his decline, there were still moments when flashes of the old Capone emerged. A phrase spoken sharply, a memory recalled with surprising clarity, a gesture that reminded visitors of the boss he had once been. But those moments were fleeting. More often, he sat quietly, detached from the empire that had once consumed him, his mind retreating into simpler thoughts. In January 1947, Al Capone suffered a massive stroke at his Palm Island home. Doctors rushed to his side, and for a brief time, he seemed to recover. But pneumonia soon set in, weakening his already fragile body. On January 25, 1947, at the age of 48, Al Capone died surrounded by his family. His death was reported around the world. For some, it was the end of a reign of terror. For others, it was the closing of a chapter in American history that had been as thrilling as it was violent. His funeral was modest compared to his life. Held in Chicago, it drew family, a handful of friends, and curious onlookers. The man who had once controlled an empire of bootleg liquor, gambling, and racketeering was laid to rest in Mount Carmel Cemetery, buried beside his father and brother. Reporters described the quiet procession, noting the absence of the lavish spectacle many might have expected. In death, Capone was reduced not to a king but to a man in a coffin, mourned by his wife and son. In the days that followed, editorials filled newspapers with reflections on his life. Some described him as a monster who had terrorized a city. Others painted him as a symbol of the failure of prohibition, a man who thrived because lawmakers had created a market he exploited with ruthless efficiency. For ordinary citizens, his death felt like the end of an era, the final curtain on the Roaring '20s and the bloody prohibition years that had changed America forever. At Palm Island, the mansion stood as a reminder of the man he had been. Tourists slowed their boats to catch glimpses, whispering about Scarface, about the gangster who had once been America's most notorious criminal. Over time, the legend grew larger than the man. Films, books, and television shows transformed him into a cultural icon, the archetype of the mob boss in a fedora with a cigar in hand. But those who had seen him in his final years knew the truth. The legend had ended not with a bullet in the street, but with illness and silence in the quiet of a Florida home. The boy from Brooklyn who dropped out of school at 14, who earned his scars in a bar fight, who rose under Johnny Torrio, who became public enemy number one, who outwitted lawmen for a decade, and who finally fell to unpaid taxes. His story was complete. And though his empire had long since moved on, his name remained etched into history as the face of an era when crime and glamour collided in America's most turbulent decade. When Al Capone was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in 1947, it marked the end of a life that had dominated headlines for more than 2 decades. But in many ways, his story was only beginning. Death has a way of transforming men into myths, and for Capone, the transformation was swift. Within days, the newspapers that had once condemned him were already shaping his legend. Some cast him as a cautionary tale of ambition gone too far. Others immortalized him as a symbol of the Prohibition era, the man who had come to represent both the glamour and the violence of the Roaring '20s. Inside the outfit, his passing was almost a footnote. By the time he died, Capone had been out of power for more than a decade. The organization had learned from his mistakes, shifting toward a quieter, more invisible model of leadership. Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca, who assumed control after Capone's fall, ruled with a subtlety that ensured the outfit survived for decades. They avoided the spotlight, preferring efficiency over spectacle. They allowed Capone's legend to dominate the past while they built a future in the shadows. But outside the underworld, Capone's name only grew. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists couldn't resist the drama of his life. The scar on his face, the fedora tilted low, the cigar clamped between his teeth. These images became shorthand for the gangster archetype. Even people who knew nothing about prohibition could recognize Scarface. His story was retold again and again, each version layering new exaggerations onto the truth. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in particular, became a cornerstone of his legend. Though never proven to be directly involved, the event became inseparable from his name. For decades, it was cited as the ultimate symbol of gangland ruthlessness. Chicago's reputation as a city of crime owed much to that bloody morning, and Capone's shadow loomed over every retelling. His charitable acts, too, became part of the myth. The soup kitchens he funded during the Depression, the coal he provided for poor families in the winter, the tips he handed out freely to waiters and cab drivers. These gestures softened the edges of his brutality in the public imagination. Some saw him as a Robin Hood figure, a man who broke the law but gave back to the people. Others argued that his generosity was nothing more than self-promotion, a way to buy loyalty and deflect criticism. Either way, it worked. To this day, stories of Capone's kindness coexist with tales of his violence, painting him as a complex figure who defies simple categorization. Academics and historians debated his significance. Some argued he was merely the byproduct of prohibition, a man who thrived because the government had outlawed something the public demanded. Without that law, they said, Capone would have been just another hustler lost in the crowd. Others contended that he was something more, a genius of organization, a man who built a criminal empire with a sophistication that foreshadowed the corporate-like structures of modern organized crime. For Chicago, Capone's memory was both a burden and a tourist attraction. The city that had once lived in fear of him later leaned into his notoriety. Tourists flocked to see sights tied to his reign: the Lexington Hotel, where he kept his headquarters, the garage on Clark Street, site of the massacre, and even his grave, where visitors left coins and cigars in tribute. Chicago officials bristled at the association, preferring to highlight the city's architecture, culture, and industry, but they could never fully escape the name. Al Capone had become part of Chicago's identity. Hollywood embraced him wholeheartedly. From the 1932 film Scarface to countless later portrayals, Capone became the template for the gangster character. Actors studied his mannerisms, directors recreated his world, and audiences thrilled to stories that blended fact with fiction. Even when films didn't use his name, they used his image: the swagger, the suit, the fedora, the ruthless charm. In shaping the American wire imagination of organized crime, Al Capone was unmatched. In popular culture, his legend often outgrew the reality. Myths circulated that he had hidden millions of dollars in secret vaults, that he had controlled the entire U.S. government, that he had ordered assassinations on a whim. Some stories were true, many were not, but all contributed to the aura that surrounded him. When television personality Geraldo Rivera famously opened Al Capone's vault on live television in 1986, millions tuned in, hoping to glimpse hidden treasure. The vault was empty, but the event itself proved how strong the fascination remained. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Capone's legacy was the contradiction he embodied. He was a man of immense violence, responsible for countless deaths, yet he also played the role of benefactor. He was a criminal who lived outside the law, yet he was brought down by something as mundane as taxes. He was a man who built his power on secrecy and intimidation, yet he craved the spotlight and welcomed reporters. He was both monster and myth, feared and admired, condemned and celebrated. As decades passed, Capone's story became less about the details of his crimes and more about what he represented. He was the face of an era when America tried to legislate morality and failed spectacularly. He was proof that prohibition didn't eliminate vice, it created empires. He was the symbol of the roaring 20s wild energy, its excess, its contradictions. To historians, he became a case study in the unintended consequences of law. To the public, he remained the ultimate gangster. Even in death, Al Capone's name carried weight. Politicians referenced him, authors studied him, filmmakers reimagined him. His mansion in Florida became a point of fascination, his grave a site of pilgrimage, his life a story retold endlessly. Few men in history have straddled the line between reality and legend so completely. In the end, Al Capone left behind no empire, no dynasty, no lasting fortune. The outfit thrived without him, stronger in its invisibility than in his flamboyance. His wealth dwindled, his health failed, his final years were spent in decline. But what he did leave behind was a legend so powerful that more than 70 years after his death, his name still resonates. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born into poverty in Brooklyn in 1899, one of 9 children of hard-working Italian immigrants who dreamed only of stability. His father cut hair, his mother sewed clothes, and they tried to raise their children to avoid the gangs that ruled the neighborhood. But the streets had their own pull. By 14, Al had abandoned school after striking a teacher, convinced that fists and wit would carry him further than books ever could. He was right, though in ways his parents could never have imagined. As a teenager, Capone ran errands for local gangs and eventually caught the eye of Johnny Torrio, a man who believed crime should be run like a business. Torrio gave him more than protection. He gave him a philosophy. Al also worked for Frankie Yale at the Harvard Inn, where he earned the scar that would mark him for life. A knife across his cheek transformed him into Scarface, a nickname he despised but one that ensured no one forgot him. Even then, Al was more than just muscle. He had charm, the ability to laugh and intimidate in the same breath, a balance of menace and charisma that would make him unforgettable. In 1919, Torrio invited him to Chicago, and it was there that Capone's destiny began. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, created an underground economy overnight. People wanted liquor, and Al was there to supply it. Under Torrio's guidance, he managed breweries, speakeasies, and gambling dens, learning how to control both business and men. When Torrio nearly died in an assassination attempt in 1925, he stepped aside, leaving the empire to his protege. At only 26 years old, Al Capone became boss of the Chicago outfit. For the next decade, Capone ruled Chicago with a mix of generosity and terror. He controlled breweries, gambling halls, brothels, and protection rackets, raking in millions while bribing politicians and policemen. He gave the public what they craved: liquor, entertainment, excitement, and many adored him for it. He also gave back, opening soup kitchens during the Depression and handing out cash to the poor. But beneath the image of benefactor was a ruthless enforcer. His rivals fell to bullets, his enemies vanished, and his dominance was cemented in fear. The height of his reign came in the late 1920s, when his name was known across America. He dressed in tailored suits, smoked thick cigars, and dined like royalty. He was a gangster, but he carried himself like a celebrity. The press loved him, sometimes condemning, sometimes glamorizing, but always covering him. He seemed untouchable, a man who lived above the law, yet Chicago bled under his rule. Rival gangs fought constantly, and Capone answered every challenge with escalating violence. The climax came on February 14, 1929, when 7 members of Bugs Moran's gang were gunned down in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Though never directly tied to the killings, the massacre became inseparable from his name. It secured his dominance but also sealed his infamy. The public who once